Capcom video games go back nearly as far as I can remember. From about the mid-1980s onward, they were a staple of arcade and Nintendo home gaming, producing some of the best games I played as a child. Capcom never was much of a supporter of Sega's efforts, however. The Master System didn't receive a single Capcom-developed title during its entire life, nor did the Sega CD or the Game Gear. Even the mighty Genesis, a system that sold extremely well in the early to mid-1990s, didn't see a Capcom-developed title until well into its lifetime. The Capcom games these systems did receive were developed and published on license from Capcom by other companies, leading to all sorts of variation in their quality. All that changed when Sega released the Saturn console in 1994. Capcom immediately secured a third-party license and began developing games for it. In fact, Capcom would go on to be one of the Saturn's most prominent third parties, releasing over 30 software titles for the platform. In this episode, we will be looking at some of those games and how they fared. This is part one of a two-part series, so sit back, relax, and get ready for Capcom and the Sega Saturn, Part 1. There are lots of people that hate on this game, but I'm not one of them. Street Fighter the movie was released in August of 1995, making it the first Street Fighter game the Saturn would get. I admit it's quite a bit different from what the series had been known for visually, using digitized assets from the Jean-Claude Van Damme movie produced the year before. The good news is that it plays very similar to Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, which means that even if you hate the visuals, there can still be a bit of fun to be had here. I don't think Capcom had any plans to release it outside of Japan, where it was known as Street Fighter Real Battle on Film. It would take third-party publisher Acclaim to pick up the property and deliver it to other regions. This one tends to get overlooked next to the more popular fighting games on the Saturn, but I think it's worth picking up and doesn't play nearly as terrible as some will have you believe.
Round 2, fight! You win!
Also in August of 1995, Capcom dabbled into the interactive movie genre they so dubbed. I'm not even going to try to pronounce this title, so I'll instead put it up on the screen. It's an interactive adventure game based on an anime series of the same name. It centers around a supernatural young girl, Hanako, who helps out school children whenever they are in trouble. It plays like you'd expect. Follow the on-screen prompts to progress the story. But if you don't know the language, it's tough to follow. One of the more strange Capcom efforts on the Saturn. In November of 1995, Capcom released XMen Children of the Atom for the Saturn, an incredibly accurate port of the CPS2-driven arcade game. I say incredible because the Saturn had a tiny amount of RAM to do a title such as this, yet you'd need to put it side by side to the arcade original to catch most of the differences. This was the blueprint for every Capcom-produced Marvel game for years, right down to the sprites, animations, and gameplay. Characters are huge, the background's detailed and faithful, and even the music is memorable. It's another one that I don't think Capcom intended to release outside of Japan, and Acclaim would come to the rescue yet again. It's much harder than most of the Street Fighter games, so if you enjoy a challenge, you should appreciate this one even more.
Round
2, fight! Heat flight! Heat flight! Heat flight! Optic blast! Optic blast! Optic blast! Optic blast! Optic blast! Optic blast!
Capcom started 1996 off with a bang, dropping Street Fighter Zero in January. Known as Street Fighter Alpha in the US and Europe, this was sort of a prequel series that takes place in between the first and second Street Fighter games. You'll see some familiar faces here, but a few new ones as well. The gameplay is mostly the same as previous Street Fighters in feel, but now you get a revamped super combo system with 3 tiers, as well as a heavy reliance on chain combos. Other little touches like air blocking, counters, and roll recoveries differentiate the gameplay. I adored this game upon its release. I dug the new art style and instantly picked up its gameplay with no problem. This was unfortunately a victim of PlayStation bias upon its release. In what has to be one of the biggest shit shows I've ever witnessed, Die Hard Game Fan, a popular gaming magazine in the 1990s, proclaimed the PlayStation version better based on its shadows being blue like the arcade during super combos. The Saturn game actually had super combos with more color, which was deemed not arcade accurate and thus less of a product. The Saturn version actually had 2 sets of shadows, the original arcade version blue, and an enhanced set if you chose the remixed music option. GameFan followed up claiming the error was because of their review copy wasn't complete, yet refused to re-review the Saturn version, because one of the morons on the original review team simply refused to accept he was wrong. This resulted in the PlayStation game being rated perfectly, with the magazine even blaming the Saturn hardware's lack of transparency as the reason its shadows weren't blue. It was a fine example of the uphill battle that Sega faced in light of the immense popularity of the PlayStation brand.
KO. You win.
1996 kept churning out the hits, with Capcom releasing Vampire Hunter, known as Night Warriors in the US and Europe. This sequel to the first Darkstalkers game expands the roster, adds chain combos, and includes 2 new super combo systems. Just as beautiful as the first game, it's a great representation of the Saturn's ability to do these kinds of games even without a RAM expansion. As expected, some of the animation frames needed to be cut, but there is an option to restore the full frames if you choose the same character to battle against. On most characters you won't notice much of a difference, but on the larger guys the difference can be quite extreme. No matter, Vampire Hunter here is a grade A experience through and through. Visual, sound, and gameplay all make it a must-own effort that was a big part of my Saturn library in those early days. Capcom was back again with another interactive movie in March of 1996, this time based on Street Fighter II. You take control of one of Shadowloo's cyborg data collectors, where you must analyze the combatants and their skills during each segment. The better you do, the more powerful you become, ultimately leading to a one-on-one showdown with the man Ryu himself. It has multiple endings and is based on the animated movie released a few years prior. It even has some extra scenes not included in that film. It's a strange product of Capcom's obsession with full motion video at the time. It was released on 2 discs and was never released outside of Japan.
なるほど。結構できるじゃねえか。気に入ったぜ。昇竜拳。
April of 1996 brought with it Rockman X3, the Japanese version of Megaman X3. This was a peculiar choice given that it was a Super Nintendo game originally. Because the Saturn didn't support the low-resolution mode of the original game, we get awkward borders here that take up quite a bit of screen space. The biggest issue is the lack of any real visual upgrades. While they did add some cinemas, the actual game looks remarkably like its Super Nintendo counterpart, a disappointing twist considering its ludicrous, full retail asking price. Instead of taking an opportunity to really enhance the game and make it something special as a 32-bit upgrade, it's nothing more than a downgraded 16-bit game. It is still a Mega Man game, however, so of course at its core it's still a fun game that's designed well. Which side of the fence you fall on may vary, but this was a huge disappointment for me and a game the Saturn simply didn't need. The US never received it, but Virgin Interactive did do a European release. Capcom loved making games for the Saturn so much, they even did their own tabletop Mahjong game for it in June of 1996. These games were a dime a dozen in Japan, so Capcom following the trend wasn't surprising. It's Japanese text heavy and was never released outside of Japan. In August of 1996, Capcom released one of the most unique puzzle games on the Saturn, Nazomakaimura Incredible Toons. It's based on the Dynamix puzzle series that started with The Incredible Machine, and this is a take on their Sid and Al's Incredible Toons directly. Essentially, you need to figure out how to finish the puzzle that you have on screen. Most of these actions become obvious pretty quickly, while some may be daunting, even cruel, with the killing of the main hero. The objectives are in Japanese, so it does take some trial and error to figure out what you need to do if you don't read the language. It never left Japan, of course, and the only other system to see a port was the PlayStation. You won't find many games like it on the old Saturn, and if you enjoy a good challenge, I do recommend it. September of 1996 brought with it a port of the CPS-1 developed Warriors of Fate, known under its Japanese name of Tenchio Kuraru 2. This is a two-player co-op hack-and-slash beat-em-up based on an old comic series that ran in the mid-80s. It looks very similar to other Capcom beat-em-ups and has great color, sprite size, and animations. You get a bunch of characters to choose from with different styles, and I really like the gameplay here. Whether on foot or on horseback, the screen is always loaded with bad guys and special effects. It's the kind of stuff Capcom excelled at in the previous era, and it finally came home to a system that could do it justice. If you are a fan of the genre and have a friend in tow, you can't do much better on the Saturn. The story text is in Japanese, and as you probably already guessed, it never left Japan. Capcom wasn't done in September of 1996, as it also released Street Fighter Zero 2, or Alpha 2 if you prefer. This sequel expanded the roster even further, deepened the story, and added a ton of hidden characters. It's a massive improvement visually over the first game, now with more detailed backgrounds that feature a lot more animation. Even the music sees a big improvement, with some of Street Fighter's best tunes being represented right here. Most of the gameplay advancements from the first game are still here, though enhanced and improved in some form, and the chain combo system is replaced by the new custom combo system. This allows you a limited time to connect just about any type of attack back to back. This is a game that would see Saturn 2D fighting games take a huge step away from its PlayStation competition in regards to quality. While the PlayStation game isn't bad, this is the preferred version in regards to animation and content without question. It's a must-own for any fighting game fan. (1996) would come to a close for Capcom with the December release of Super Puzzle Fighter 2X, or Turbo outside of Japan. This is another puzzle game, but this time much closer to the stuff you know so well. Here you will connect the same colored jewels until you get a breaking gem to destroy it. Build bigger jewels to score higher combo bonuses, and bring it all crashing down on your opponent's head. The art style uses chibi-style characters from a few different Capcom fighting game franchises, and is quite colorful and well animated. If you like the falling piece genre of puzzle games, but want a bit more flash and excitement, this may be exactly what you need. The 2-player mode is a blast, but will test all but the strongest of bonds. Capcom would ring in 1997 with a bang, with the January release of Rockman 8, the newest addition to the mainline series of Mega Man games. Here we would see the first real 32-bit upgrade to the series, and it's immediately noticeable in the solid presentation. Lots of stage variety, great color, impressive animation, and a CD soundtrack to bring it all together. The Saturn version has some notable changes from the PlayStation game, particularly in the music, which is arranged differently here and even has a few exclusive tracks. I really enjoyed this game overall and found it to be one of the better additions to the series during the 32-bit era of machines. It plays a lot like the old NES games mixed with a bit of the X series, and was better than the Saturn's Megaman X4 port in every conceivable way. European Saturn owners get shafted here, as it was never released there. March of 1997 would bring with it Capcom's first foray into the magical world of the extended RAM cartridge, with the mech fighting extravaganza Cyberbots Full Metal Madness. If you have ever wanted to climb into a huge mech to wreak havoc upon your foes, this is the game you want. Thanks to the additional RAM, you get great animation here across both the characters and the backdrops. Each special attack looks phenomenal, and every battle features loads of environment damage thanks to the lumbering giant's efforts. It's a real shame this one remained locked in Japan because it's so different from the other fighters Capcom was doing at the time. It was one of their rare efforts that didn't feel like a Street Fighter clone, and it absolutely destroys the PlayStation release. There is also a big box limited edition of this that comes with an art book that has a pop-out scene from the game built into it.
Two, proceed. Three-hit combo. Target destroyed.
Capcom got in on the popular Japanese dating sim genre with a port of its arcade game that I call Quiz and Dreams, but the full name is actually on your screen right now, in June of 1997. Answer questions to gain the attention, admiration, and eventually love of the girl you want. It's your typical Japanese zaniness, and it was only released in Japan. Those of you that can read it will likely find something here to enjoy. The rest of you, move on to the next game.
ボタンを押して。いくよ。やるじゃない。お前が選ばれたのか？へへ。これからいろいろと。
July of 1997 would bring with it one of Capcom's biggest releases on the Saturn, a port of the mega-popular Biohazard known as Resident Evil in the West. And lucky for Saturn owners, this port turned out pretty damn good. You know the setup. A big pharmaceutical company has been experimenting with a new virus that has gotten out and turned its employees into bloodthirsty zombies. To make matters worse, you find out these morons were working on biological weapons to boot, which are loose in the mansion you are trapped in. Resident Evil wasn't the first game of its type, but it was the first game to get it so right. The gameplay here is much faster and smoother than previous games in the genre, and the story is light years ahead of most games of the era. It was immediately gripping, interesting, and kept you glued to your TV as it all unfolded. It set a standard for the action-adventure game that would mold software for years to come, and an excellent Saturn title in every way. There are some trade-offs from the PlayStation release, particularly in the lack of transparencies and longer load times, but you do get some Saturn exclusive content here, like an extra boss fight in a battle game mode that acts as a survival run once you get really good at the game. August of 1997 brought us yet another Rockman release, this time Rockman X4. Called Megaman X4 in the West, it was the newest entry into the X series of games, and the first exclusively designed for the 32-bit systems. Aside from the upgrades to sound and visuals, the biggest addition here is the ability to choose the alternate character, Zero, who now has his own story, gameplay, ending, and is selectable right from the get-go. This provides a great contrast to the traditional gameplay of Mega Man himself, and makes X4 here one of the better releases in the series at that point. This holds up remarkably well today thanks to the great 2D presentation, and while it is challenging, you won't regret replaying its great looking stages a few times to get good at them. Much like Mega Man 8, Europe never got a release of this on the Saturn, but the Japanese version is affordable if you are looking for a physical copy of it. That wraps up part 1 of my Capcom special for the Sega Saturn. As you can see, we have worked our way up to mid-1997, and there have been some excellent titles released on the platform. Whether you were a fan of fighting games, platformers, puzzle games, adventure games, and hell, even full-motion video games, Capcom had something for you. It was incredible owning a Japanese Saturn that first 2.5 years, because Capcom always seemed to have something worth buying every time you looked. And as good as things had been at that point, they only get better from here. In part 2, we will be taking a look at the rest of the games that Capcom brought to the Saturn, as well as talk about a few big omissions that never made their way over to my favorite Sega hardware. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.